Sure. Thanks, Paulette. Hi, everyone. Thank you for attending. I'm Bill Hall. I'm PwC Cyber Risk and Reg Microsoft Alliance Director. And we're going to have a quick discussion on a data-centric security model. As you listen, please ask, as Paulette mentioned, please ask any questions, any comments, throw them in the chat. I'll be monitoring that. And we will address them at the end of the discussion. And again, just as Paula mentioned, we're looking for you to come off camera or come on camera, come off mute, and ask those questions direct. With that, I think I'll hand it over to Brian to quickly introduce himself and get us started.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Bill. I'm Brian Stockberger. I'm a security architect at Microsoft. So in my role, I get the fortune of working with partners like PwC as well as customers and implementing and using Microsoft security services across their landscape. So I'm thrilled to be here with Adam and Josh.
Yeah, Brian, I appreciate that and echo what you said. Also thrilled to be here with this opportunity to partner with Microsoft on this topic. By way of introduction, I'm Adam Ames. I'm a director actually based out of Atlanta, Georgia, coming to you here from the Washington, D.C. area. I am in our cybersecurity practice focused on data risk and privacy. So for the last 13, 14 years, been working in this space alongside Josh. So I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Adam. And hi, everybody. Josh Rattan. I'm a partner also in our data risk and privacy practice. Excited to be able to talk to you today alongside Adam and Brian with our Microsoft colleagues about data-centric security. Our practice is predominantly focused on helping clients think about data, its risks across the life cycle, how to put in the proper controls to manage and mitigate those risks. Adam and I have the luxury and fortune of being able to work with Microsoft and helping our clients to implement Microsoft technologies to achieve those goals and outcomes. And so that will be a real core focus of today's discussion. So with that, why don't we pivot to the next slide and just sort of lay the foundation for today's talk. When we think about data-centric security, it's probably best to start with kind of the historic or legacy view of security controls. And the idea is that data-centric security is sort of a pivot away from thinking about putting boundaries at the container level of different applications or data stores, and to be more data-centric, meaning we're looking at the data, we're understanding its aboutness, the context of the data, what's happening to it, and making security decisions or even retention and disposition decisions based on the data itself and what it is and its purpose and use. The great thing about Microsoft's capabilities in this space is that it really enables organizations to take advantage of a data-centric approach. And in doing so, you really maximize your investment in the Microsoft platform and strengthen your security capabilities at the same time. So with that as a backdrop, what we want to do is really get into more detail about what we mean by data-centric security and how to bring that to life in the Microsoft 365 environment. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Adam, who's going to take us a bit further into the discussion.
Yeah, no, thanks, Josh. And to really put a point on what Josh mentioned around this model is a shift historically from that concept where historically we were setting up security defenses in isolation. And here we're looking to put data itself at the center and propagate the appropriate controls based on that data's sensitivity or aboutness or usage. And you can see as now we're starting to apply this largely to the zero trust security principle. This should be familiar to most on this call, if not everybody. Maybe what's new is how it's now being illustrated. So the zero trust security principle is more of a framework. It's not a roadmap or a prescriptive step-by-step, do this, do that, but rather, how do we apply the appropriate controls, again, now based on the data at its core. So if we work around this framework, around this concept, when we start talking about contextual intelligence that the data can provide, and we start looking at who is accessing it, well, what type of users are we looking at? Are we looking at employees? Are we looking at third parties? Are we looking at vendors, business to business, contractors, customers? And based on who, we can also start asking a lot of the questions of, what do we know about these users? Are they trusted? Are they, as an employee, we know a lot about them. As engaged third parties, maybe we know a little less. What about those new relationships? Are we okay allowing unknown users to access certain data elements? As we move to that device, we can apply the same lens. We can start saying, what type of device can access the data? Does that device need to be wholly managed? Could it be that kiosk sitting in the library? Or could it be a partially managed mobile device? Again, now is where we start bringing in the data, the aboutness, the sensitivity to say, maybe that's okay if it's public information. Maybe it's okay at certain levels if it's internal or business use information. But as we start going up the sensitivity rank, as we start increasing its risk appetite, or I should say decreasing our risk appetite based on the actual data itself, now we can apply appropriate friction points where historically they had been more broad-based. The same questions would apply to the application. Not only who is accessing it, by what means, where is this data being accessed from and to? So if we start thinking about, are these applications third-party hosted, third-party managed? Are they homegrown? Are they open source? Are they SaaS? Where they are in relation, as we keep going down, to our network? Are they in the cloud? Are they on-prem? Do we have visibility into what that infrastructure looks like and where the applications and where those data sets are being stored? You'll hear throughout this conversation the concepts of the data, data at rest versus data in motion. You'll hear the concepts of starting to identify where that data sits. And all of it is being critical of applying those friction points throughout the zero trust framework. Inevitably, when we start talking about orchestration and automation, is where we start finding those opportunities for automation in response to security incidents or events. If you think about the historic use of solutions like DLP, without contextual awareness, you'll oftentimes find it that it is a solution that is alerting once the data has already left versus preventing it from leaving. And that's because of that friction point that the business will always have. That's because of the challenges associated, where now this starts solving it. This starts saying collectively, of course, we don't want our most sensitive data to leave in these fashions. So when it does, now we can start applying appropriate and automated triggers and response actions to prevent a whole lot more from happening, and we get early alerting. To round this out, getting the visibility based on who are we trying to report for. So an executive is going to need a different view into the nature of this environment than an administrator, than an operator, than the end user. So now once we make, even at the visibility and the governance level, contextual awareness based on the data itself, now we're able to create these different levels of visualization for the different roles that need to be aware of this information. So if we go actually to the next slide, where we've just double-clicked now on that center dial. So we've talked about the zero trust framework, the pillars and how they're applied. But when we double-click on the data itself, there's some core principles that we have to get right. We have to know that data. We have to classify it, label it, track it, and understand the data itself in order to protect that data, effectuate those appropriate controls and friction points, and then prevent it from leaving the environment where appropriate. And then throughout that cycle, govern it, manage it, report on it. And you can see all of those, as Josh mentioned, are critical throughout the data lifecycle. And when we're talking about data lifecycle, we are talking about from data creation and the data producers all the way through that disposition and disposal concepts, where we start talking about record management, legal hold, and all of that fun, again, all predicated on the understanding of the data that we are trying to protect. And really, when we start talking about a lot of these controls that everyone mentions throughout Zero Trust, that everyone mentions in a strong data security model, really we're getting into that middle section of the life cycle. Data's already been created. We have a good understanding of what we need to keep and destroy. But how do we use that data? How do we share that data? What is the appropriate mechanism to do so? The good news is, throughout this life cycle, Microsoft has some phenomenal tool sets that can highlight the strengths of what Josh was mentioning, bringing that ecosystem to bear, that rather than building any of these in isolation, now we're understanding the full stack, the capabilities. And as we flip to this next slide, now we can start getting that visual of where these example solutions on the Microsoft stack can fit into this model. So I'll pause there. Josh, Brian, anything to add as we go right into this solution side?
I guess just one thing I would highlight, Adam, is the pivot is to say, instead of thinking about configuring a given Microsoft solution like DLP or Microsoft Purview Information Protection in isolation for a given set of use cases, an alternative is to think about what is your data type that you need to protect, and how do you think about applying the necessary controls for that data type using a number of Microsoft capabilities throughout the data type's lifecycle. So, whether it's from creation and applying the appropriate sensitivity label to that content, that sensitivity label then could, have the necessary policies and requirements in DLP, CASB, et cetera. And Defender for Cloud Apps, Defender for Endpoint can make decisions as that data flows through your environment and lives through its life cycle, versus just picking a product and deploying it, right? And so that's the idea here, is to think about it more at that data type stripe level versus application or tool specific.
Josh, that's a really good point. And to even drill in and double click on another one of those examples, is based on the sensitivity of the data itself, right? As you mentioned, we're going to go ahead and label it with a data label from Purview Information Protection. That can then be associated to even the identity concepts that we're going to enable access and authorization based on the user, based on the sensitivity of the data. If you think about our public sector, that it's very much tiered. If I have certain clearance levels, I can have access to it. This is enabling that function. back in our private sector, if you think about what data should be shared with what types of third parties. Again, now even just the nature of having that label can enable that propagation throughout the security tool sets that we all have. That's a great call out.
Yeah, those are very critical insights there, Josh and Adam. If we could go back to the next slide really quickly, please. One thing I kind of wanted to call out a few things here, right? So, working with customers and really helping them from a data security model and this data-centric model that Josh and Adam kind of, conceptualized, trying to make it real and bring this to action, first and foremost is critical to be successful with a data security project is to really know your data, right? That's where the bulk of time and energy really does need to take place initially, right? Understanding where your data is, where of that data which has sensitive information that you need to be able to apply those controls, those labels, those policies, those access controls that Joss and Adam refer to, right, is really being able to completely understand what your data landscape looks like. And then you can start applying those, data security controls to protect that data and apply restrictions and all back to the risk of that data, right? So if we're talking about highly sensitive information, applying the appropriate risk levels and policies and labels to it, right? All with the emphasis of being able to prevent that data from being leaked into the inappropriate hands, right? Whether that's inside users that are not privileged or not able to see certain privileged data, whether it's externally sharing, which was kind of mentioned already earlier, and then being able to apply governance and lifecycle management over that data based upon governance policies, maybe based upon industry, being able to apply that lifecycle management where data does not exist longer than it should from a lifecycle governance perspective, right? So kind of bringing all those things together is where we'll kind of talk about things kind of on the next slide here. So what does this look like, right? We've got this is a pretty busy slide, but kind of at the center, I'll try and break it down. What's core is classifying that data. Once you understand where your data is, being able to classify it using the data classification service, right? So we've got, sensitive information types, not all data is created equal, not all data is sensitive, but being able to differentiate sensitive data from not sensitive data based upon information types. So within the data classification service, there's a whole host of out-of-the-box sensitive information types that can help with that data classification. And then we've got, custom classifiers that can be built based upon, specific scenarios, specific use cases. Specific organizations, might have their own types of data. And so they're using the concept of trainable classifiers to be able to reason through data that is unique to an organization to be able to build your own sets of classifiers, right? So the data classification service is really kind of at the center, being able to classify that data. And then from there, once we have identified the data, being able to then apply those sensitivity labels and policies on top of that data, right, appropriately. We know that sensitive information in the form of like credit cards should be restricted. It should be encrypted. So being able to apply those security policies. Now, as we kind of make our way around this slide, obviously Microsoft Purview Information Protection is solely, or is, built within the Microsoft 365 platform. But I do want to highlight that it is not just data that exists solely in Microsoft, 365, or even in, Microsoft's other cloud services like Azure, right? It does provide a comprehensive set of ways to be able to, do that data discovery, being able to identify data, wherever it exists, endpoints, devices, other applications, cloud applications, things like, SaaS-based applications, on-prem data sources, file shares. We do know that, a bulk of organizations' data is sitting on-prem in file shares and SharePoint servers, et cetera. And so again, being able to include that is critical. And then, building on top of that is taking that data and, we've identified where the data is. We understand, where sensitive data exists based upon those sensitive information types. Now, from that data-centric model, we can start making policy decisions on, who has access it, which labels should be applied based upon these sensitivity labels. And then we can move that into, our other advanced compliance solutions like advanced e-discovery, insider risk management, and so on. So again, just wanted to kind of walk through, at a very high level, what Microsoft Purview Information Protection kind of looks like. And in the next few slides, what I'll do is kind of show some kind of examples of what that looks like. What's nice about our unified information protection is you can apply, one policy that can work across all of these different workloads, including applications, services, devices, et cetera. And you can create and manage and deploy this policy from a single place, from a single location, from a single console, which is the Microsoft Purview Compliance Portal, right? And so from here, we can apply those policies. And on the next slide, what we'll see is where it can integrate. We can integrate that with, these third-party SaaS-based applications, right? Whether it's Box or Salesforce. I'll highlight that these can be, sanctioned applications by your organization. Maybe Box or OneDrive is kind of the official sanctioned file sharing application. But you also need to protect that data that might exist out in, Google Workspace or, personal Dropboxes, et cetera. So again, being able to extend those policies out to kind of non-Microsoft apps as well as beyond your sanctioned applications. Again, from a single console, being able to kind of control those policies across all of these data repositories. And then on the next slide, we'll kind of go a little bit further where we can, this example is being able to create a very specific rule, right? So, as an example, being able to, one of the key data, leakage points of, challenges for organizations is, data being exfiltrated via, USB drives, as an example. So, there may be a need for organizations to be able to utilize USB drives. So you can audit that activity where data that does get copied to USB drives can be audited, and you can even, block certain types of devices or, allow certain devices that are, customer issued, customer sanctioned. But again, being able to apply those different restrictions based upon, different scenarios and different, different use cases. And then on the next slide, here we can see, we're leveraging those sensitive information types that we've identified from the data classification services. We can apply that policy, and again, whether it's sensitive information types identified by your trainable classifiers, the out-of-the-box sensitive information types, or sensitivity labels. We can even apply, exceptions, right? Not every policy is going to be applicable to, everyone. So we can create exceptions and then, set actions to be able to truly protect that data. And we'll get into some of that on the next slide. So here we can also, be able to create more granular policy conditions, right? So the use of and or. So I think in this example, we've got the use of credit card numbers, in an email, unless the user is, it's being sent from somebody from the finance team, or sent to a whitelisted recipient domain such as Fabricom. So maybe they're the your credit card processing company, and certain users do need to process credit card numbers and exchange that information. So it's not like all credit card information needs to be it needs to be protected, but it does need to be transferred and moved within the organization. So again, we can set up these fine-grained policies to be able to deal with that those situations and exceptions. And then I think on the next slide, we'll start talking a little bit about, violations of, policies. So say, for instance, if a DLP policy does trigger, right, what happens, right? So we can issue an alert that can then, be sent off to Microsoft 365 Defender, which is more of a comprehensive incident management capabilities to be able to report on that alert, to report on those potential uses or violations, if you will. And then you can see here where the details of that incident and of that alert are available for searching and investigation as needed, right? Where we can match the sensitive content in an alerts view for triage and advanced investigation. So those are just kind of a very quick kind of walkthrough of a few examples, a few use cases around, the implementation of sensitivity labels and sensitive information types, how those can get applied to DLP policies, and how you can, be able to track the usage and even, alerts that may come up from that. So I think here I'll pass it back to you, Adam.
Yeah, no, Brian, that was perfect, because I'll touch on a couple points that you highlighted towards the end, where you're talking about enabling investigations is a really big function here, because we all know in security incidents, information is key. That is critical. Who did what, when, how, where, why, right? So having that at our fingertips, it moves the needle significantly, even if it is a reactive control, right? Up front, when you're highlighting the configuration of these sensitivity labels, really what I want to highlight there is it is a mechanism to enable either systematically and automatically, or the end user to assign a label to, in this case, a Word document, a PowerPoint, whatever that looks like, in this unstructured data world, where now if we say that this document contains the most sensitive data, it contains a restricted data element, we can then create those policies and rules in the downstream security tool sets to then key off of that data element, that label. So you can imagine that scenario. I've labeled something restricted. I go to email it to some unknown third party, and I'm going to get that pop-up that says not allowed. And now it's based on the data itself, not based on a nebulous and generic rule set where it increased that friction and the users get that confusion. So I think those are really good call outs, but how do we effectuate this? How do we ultimately get our organizations, our clients, our customers to take this on? And what often we find success is starting with executive alignment. What do executives understand? They understand the policy. They understand the impact to the users. And what we cannot do is enact a policy or a change that will then negatively impact the business. We can't remove that from the operation. So to start, putting in simple terms, what are we trying to accomplish? Setting that policy. And a perfect example here is defining who can have access to what type of data and what types of devices are able to access specific locations. So you start with this very easy policy that sets the direction. From there, you can define the standards, you can define the procedures, and ultimately turn on these controls that we've been highlighting. And it is abundantly clear end to end that now, to bring it back to what Josh mentioned up front, we're not setting up any of these security controls in isolation. We're not defining these standards and procedures without regard to the policy, but rather we're taking the data itself, letting it inform based on the aboutness and the sensitivity of it, where do we want to go? So ultimately, when we talk about executive alignment, that's what we're saying, putting it in very plain terms that can establish the policy all the way through these controls. Josh, I'll hand it back over to you. I know we're getting close on time.
Thanks, Adam. Yeah, one of the questions that we commonly get from our clients is where to start. And when we bring forward the data-centric approach, one of the natural pushbacks might be that a client will say, well, we have a huge number of data types. Could we get into a situation where this approach might not scale very easily, especially if we think about things from starting at a pretty granular data type level. And so there are a couple of different ways to maybe overcome those issues that we've seen clients successfully navigate. One is to think about taking a stepwise approach based on a given business function, department, or business process, where you sort of narrow in and hone in on a given set of use cases, where there's clear ownership at the organization with users that know that data and can be very helpful in understanding how that data is created, used, where it's sent, et cetera. And then, creating, for that particular department or business process, the necessary labels and controls and policies the team described, and sort of then going department by department or business process by business process. And accelerating sort of as you get your feet underneath you. That's one approach. Another approach that we've seen is that there's an ability to maybe come up with a general set of sensitivity labels, and to do that in more of your standard 4 or 5 tier data classification framework. And then to think about taking a more compartmentalized approach for specific use cases and issues as they come up. So an example of a compartmentalized approach might be, well, our organization has a sensitive deal transaction that it's making, and so that deal warrants having a specific sensitive information type or sensitivity label for a particular set of data, and we're going to follow that through. And so as these compartmentalized use cases are established, you take more of your data-centric approach there, or as you understand better the behaviors from your general 4-tier data classification piece, if you're running into friction points, you can for certain data types or processes, you can bring those back into more of a compartmentalized view. Both are successful ways of overcoming these sort of implementation where to start questions.
Joshua, I think. Oh,
yeah, I
sorry.
think we've got a few questions coming in through the feed here. I see Oliver, you've asked the question, how do you simplify the impact of labeling based on sensitive information types to executives? Brian and Adam, do you want to weigh in on that one? I guess, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so go ahead, Adam.
All right. We'll get coordinated sometime, right? So look, when I consider the uses of the labels themselves, based on the information types, right? Josh highlighted a couple of different approaches, whether that be data-centric, information-centric labeling, or data classification-centric, which was what Brian highlighted on the screen there. Ultimately, it is going to be up to the culture of the organization. If data classification is widely used and understood, then it makes sense. And when we talk about impact to the executives, in our experience, it's about showing the roadmap and the progression. So if you upfront are labeling it and we're saying, hey, this is step 0, as Brian well articulated, we have to know where this data sits in order to apply whatever security controls, remove friction where we can, add friction where we need to. Then it's a matter of a discussion point when we talk about impact. We talk about what the decisions are up front of the different models, and then where does that apply? Because ultimately it's finding that balance between an operational burden, which can grow if left unchecked, and how much we're applying the friction to the users to do manual labeling versus automatic labeling versus understanding that compartment or department specific approach there. So I don't know if that answered part of it, Brian. I know I interrupted you as well.
No, I think you, at least from my perspective, you captured it nicely.
I want to come to Ash's question, to Josh's comments. Where do you see 1 or 2 biggest challenges as we implement and start monitoring? It's a great question. I guess in my experience, Ash, is one of the common questions we get is the end user engagement and what's that going to look like to make this successful. If I use sensitivity labels as an example, this is definitely forcing security to get sort of out in front of end users and have a change management program, and to really be able to clearly communicate their requirements and obligations to make this work. Coupled with that, a second challenge is to say, okay, as an organization, eventually our destination or future state North Star is to get all of our content, unstructured content in this case, labeled. And so do we want to get to a point where we're requiring labels? And a challenge that poses different challenges in certain circumstances, both user experience, as well as end user behavior. And so I think it's important to understand that you can achieve a lot of your security obligations with maybe including labeling a lot, if not all content, without having to resort to the need of enforcing and requiring labels. But that's certainly an option and a policy decision you can make. And so it's understanding what those trade-offs are in that decision, right? You may get more adoption and more things maybe get labeled more readily as a result, but do you understand what that means for mobile devices, for your user experience? And so you just got to weigh those out.
Yeah, and Josh, the good news, I know we're up against the clock here. The good news to everything you just mentioned too, that Brian articulated well, was it's fine-grained. These can be detailed in a way that impacts certain departments, certain users versus others. So as you go through this exercise of requiring labels for some, but not all, requiring it for specific applications, for specific use cases, that's where a lot of this comes in. And we find at a lot of our clients, that's where those conversations largely start. We know we need to label and classify our documents. What is that first step? And that's what we were highlighting there as well. But great call, great questions.
Okay, gentlemen, I think we are at time. That was a great discussion. Thank you very much. And thank you everyone for joining the webinar today. There is going to be a short survey in the chat window. We would appreciate it if you would fill that out. It's about a 30-second survey to help us improve events like this. And I'll let all of our speakers say goodbye. And thank you everyone for joining, and have a great day.
Thanks, team. Appreciate everybody joining.
Thanks all.
Yep. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.